Good morning. Oh, that was good. Grateful for this chance to be with you in person in Albany, and as I understand it, remotely a little bit later with the folks in Lebanon and Sweet Home, the rest of the South Santiam circuit. My name's Jared Ruari. I'm one of the co-ministers at First Christian Church here in Albany, which is 1.7 miles away is all. I had to use my navigation because I'm still new to town. I understand you're in between season with a couple of weeks here in between Pastor Alyssa concluding her ministry and Pastor Amanda Gale, who will be arriving in a couple of weeks. You all probably are pretty used to that sort of thing. You probably know more about it than I do, but it did occur to me that I was not so long ago in a pretty similar season. My spouse, Allison, and I, a little over 3 years ago, had made a big cross-country move from Nashville, Tennessee, all the way out here to Albany, Oregon. And what a big change, what a big adventure to be starting a new ministry. A little bit scary too, because we did not know a single soul in Albany other than members of the search committee we've talked to a few times. And so I can pretty easily put myself in that nervous but exciting, full of promise, full of possibility season of beginning a new ministry, welcoming a new minister. And I found one of the real gifts of this season has been it's allowed me to reflect in new ways on friendship. For my spouse and I, and for our sons too, this has been a time of building a lot of relationships from scratch. We've been living in that life cycle of new relationships where you start with awkward introductions, move on to careful acquaintanceship, then fledgling, sometimes faltering friendships, and then hopefully, eventually, those deeper, more established friendships. And what I've found is that there's a rhythm to these things. There's unmistakable rhythm, and yet, at the same time, they're not predictable. Each friendship is going to unfold in its own way and in its own time. So this is something I've felt personally attuned to as a matter of my everyday life. It's also been something of growing edge in my theology, trying to think deeper, think more theologically about friendship. And probably the main prompting for that is one of our book groups at our church has been reading John O'Donohue. He has a classic book called Anam Cara. Have any of you read that before? You might. It's pretty good. Anam Cara is Gaelic for soul friend, and that is sort of the central theme of the book, the soul friend. A soul friend is something much deeper than a good friend or even a a best friend. The way that I would describe it is a friendship so deep that it becomes an avenue for spiritual practice and even for Christian transformation. The soul friend is someone with whom you can share your innermost self. It's someone who's perceptive and attentive enough to recognize you as you are, and gracious enough to accept you as you are, safe and hospitable enough to impart to you a sense of belonging, a sense of being at home. A true soul friend is a rare thing and somewhat difficult to achieve. There's this saying that floats around online. You may have seen it in some form before. The gist of it is that our society has two main messages for us. The first message is just be yourself. The second message is no, not like that. And if you live in this social world, as we all do, we are all too accustomed to that contradictory encouragement to be authentic, but only within a limited range of expressions. So there's this encouragement towards authenticity, but authenticity that needs to color within very specific lines in order to be received and celebrated. Be yourself, but not like that. And so, with that being the character of so much of our experience together, it is such a relief to find the soul friend, someone with whom we can be ourselves, our full and authentic selves. Full stop. No further direction needed. There's nothing like a soul friend, and yet so many of us find ourselves lacking that sort of deep and spiritually significant friendship. I think mostly because it is risky. It leaves us vulnerable, trying to be in relationship at that sort of depth. And what's tricky here is that at some level, vulnerability is vulnerability, and there's no way around that. The place of vulnerability that allows for trust and connection is the very same place of vulnerability that allows for things like rupture or betrayal. And so, understandably, we are careful. By all means, let's be careful if the only choice is between careful and careless with one another. But proceeding with caution is an altogether different thing from failing to proceed at all. And in a lot of cases, we are failing to proceed at all. The trap we fall into is that we tend to want it both ways. We want connection to others, but we want to be sure that others will meet all of our expectations. We want relationships, but without any of those setbacks or diversions or places of awkwardness. We want warmth, but no possibility of getting burned. I'd like for you, if you would, to form a mental picture of two knights in shining armor who are trying to give one another a hug. That's us. That's where we end up spiritually when we seek out the connection of a friend while wanting to cling to the stability and the predictability of something more like an employee or a servant or a second party to a contract. You know, I have this concern that we are becoming so out of practice when it comes to community, so relationally risk adverse that we're willing to settle for pale imitations of friendship. I've been reading a lot about this artificial intelligence boom. And I don't pretend to know how this is going to shake out in terms of the economy or work. But what's becoming clear to me is that there are certain aspects of our human experience that we cannot outsource, not without losing so much of what's best and most beautiful about our humanity. And so I am concerned with this idea that the chat bot could be not only a source of information or a tool to work more efficiently, but that it could be something like a friend or something close enough to a friend to be a workable substitute. Because it is not a friend, it's a product, it's a servant. What it can do, and I think this is why it's alluring, what it can do is generate text that is statistically likely to make us feel flattered, or that like a person on the other side of the screen has taken an interest in us, thinks we're really cool and neat. But that is not friendship. That is an imitation of one small piece of friendship. I think of those, I love it in a TV show when there's a show within the show. And the camera will zoom out and you'll see that they're not inside of someone's house. In fact, this is unfolding on a sound stage. Not the real thing, it's a set, it's a facade. And it just feels like we're being asked in this moment to treat a facade as if it's a house. The surface appearance of something as if it's the real thing. One of the things, probably one of the most important things we learn in reading the Gospels, especially I'd say in reading the Gospel of John, is that we as Jesus followers are called to a depth of relationship that can only take shape through the risky mutuality of friendship. I do not call you servants any longer, Jesus says, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I've made known to you everything that I've heard from my Father. It seems to me that Jesus is inviting his disciples into something much deeper and more consequential even than following. When Jesus invites them to abide with him, to abide in his love just as Jesus abides in the love of God, that feels like another step or two even beyond discipleship. And the thing is, imitating, following someone's example closely, that's already an incredibly consequential thing. It is a big deal to claim someone as your guide or your mentor or your teacher. But what Jesus says goes deeper even than that. Abide with me. Let our relationship be an abode, a dwelling place. Let the love between us be the thing that makes you feel at home in yourself, with others, in the world. It's fascinating to me that John's Jesus, of all the four Jesuses, would be the one to say this. John is known, after all, for what we call his high Christology, which is to say his strong, unmistakable emphasis on the divinity of Jesus. John makes it very clear this Jesus fellow is God. Not only a good example, not only a skillful teacher, but the eternal creative Word that was with God even in the beginning. God made flesh to dwell among us for a spell. And what's amazing, and maybe even a bit surprising, is that Jesus' divinity, Jesus' godness, does not make him distant or unknowable. He doesn't ask to be revered from a distance or for his disciples to follow his directions simply as a matter of fulfilling their role. He asks them to be his friends, to live in his love, to let God's love be a place of care and belonging for them. Just one more thing. Mindy Caligari, who has written wonderfully about spiritual friendship, she says something amazing about the power of these relationships. She writes that when we live openly and honestly with at least a few others, we also necessarily open ourselves directly to the power and love of God. Now, it's not that our experience of each other in loving relationship is one and the same with an experience of God. It's more that the practices of deep friendship move us to a place of being able to encounter God more fully. We do not always even know what barriers we have put up that keep us from being open to God's presence and God's transforming love, let alone how we would go about lowering those barriers to let God in. We simply are not always aware of those barriers that keep us from God. But remember, vulnerability is vulnerability. Lowered defenses are lowered defenses. And so, if we can be open to each other, we will also find that we are open to ourselves, open to the world, open to God. And so, as we love each other truly and deeply, we'll find simultaneously through that, in that, God is working on us. God's love is transforming us through our practice of friendship. So thanks be to God for this abiding love, for a house of love big enough for me, big enough for you, big enough for all of us, alluring enough to draw us to God, strong enough to bind us together as friends. Amen.
Hymn. Our next hymn will be Gift of Love, United Methodist Hymnal 408, or on the screen. And remember, I'm coming by to get the prayer cards if you have them.